We shall continue. The next speaker is Dr. Birk. And like I said it previously, I still remember very well one of his works that has really been an eye-opener when he wrote about the battle in the Teutoburg forest. So he's not going to talk about this today, but we heard about the Teutoburg forest battle by Mr. Durschmidt, which is quite apt and conclusive. Arminius, the Cheruscan, took the Romans into a swampy forest with steep hills. It was slippery. So all of that is true, of course. However, Dr. Birk was among the first who knew about the new strategic significance of this battle in the Teutoburg forest. Based on his analysis, and this is where the images of Erich Durschmidt and our strategy considerations come together. The core idea was that the Romans thought that the Germans were scattered in little tribes, 200-300 people, maybe 10 times that, so maybe they could get organized, but those are all hostile tribes and enemies of each other, and they couldn't really have developed a strategic plan. And that was maybe the basic reason for failure. So for a long time, they didn't think that the opponent had any strategy, quality of strategy. And this Varus had, this helped them to agree among the princes that if Hymenius can prove to Marbod that he can defeat the Romans, then Marbod will march on Rome together with him. And this is true because it can be documented because the Roman emperor learned about this, and he had his Germanic guards killed because he found that the Germanic tribes could march on Rome. And sometimes we don't know, starting when your opponent develops strategic quality. And we said for a long time about the Islamic fundamentalists, it's just a temporary fad, a regional phenomenon. These are undisciplined hordes. Like the Romans said, these are just small, wild, savage Germanic tribes without any leadership. But they didn't see the point when they became better in terms of strategy. I thought that this provided us with a better understanding for Dr. Birk's presentation, just to show how the individual contributions of our conference blend together. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Too much praise for me, I guess. I remember some time ago, actually I don't remember some of my articles that I published, so thank you very much for reminding me. Thank you for the invitation to your conference. I'm pleased to be able to speak here as a practicing teacher of military history. To speak towards the end of a meeting is ambivalent. Either you run the risk of repeating what's already been said, or important things come too late for the discussion during the breaks. We don't have a lot of breaks ahead of us, but lamenting and complaining won't help if the brigadier invites us and sets the times. My subject at the beginning probably needs some explanations, already because of the term narrative. It's a commonplace, but nevertheless important. The discourse is directed in certain directions by language and terminology, and therefore we need a more detailed explanation of what terms mean. So only those who have clear terminology can command, as Goethe already knew, our literary pope. Now, theoretical explanations delight social scientists even more than their genuine research subject, and therefore I will provide some theoretical statements with practical examples from politics or history. And this can also mean that some narratives from the subject area of politics, strategy, and the image of war may not prove to be particularly valid. And I hope that in the end, more questions will remain unanswered, and this will help the further development in the strategic area as well. Now, narratives have been on vogue for some years. After the collapse of the bipolar system confrontation and the somewhat hastily proclaimed end of history, the need for regulations for the time after increased. The general mood of departure for new thinking was tangible everywhere. New concepts were developed and asked to what extent they were able to offer scientifically and politically attractive figures of thought after the resignation of salvation ideologies with their rigid interpretation schemes, which also provide political, social and other maxims that guide action. Now, narratives, irrespective of their literary context of origin, proved to be a new central topos, which, as a new pattern of research and explanation in science, was, believed to be able to look back into the past, to explain the present, and to exist in future. And very often, however, literature on the subject of narratives is found more in connection with constructed identities, self-staging, and cultural memories. It's also about artistic, media, and communicative reception. We could also call it cultural self-reflection. In political science, the narrative approach is very often dominated by the confrontation with dualism in Europe, usually connected with the aspect of identity formation and the question of whether this can be transferred from the former ideal of the nation to other forms of political organization, and can maybe also provide assistance in nation building. Narratives have not only been fashionably hyped by science and the educational landscape, they now also permeate the statements of central actors in politics, society, business, technology, and natural sciences. Everyone follows, unspokenly, his own narrative, formed by himself, and breaks it down over various intermediate levels, down to models at the various levels. As examples of central narratives, at least for the EU world, we can mention for politics, democracy, rule of law in Europe, for societies, individualization, diversity, and participation rights, for the economy, growth and prosperity, and for technology, digitization of all spheres of life. In the areas of security policy and strategy, in the military and the image of war, however, neither a central topos nor several of them can be easily identified. So the security policy discourse, that's my impression, is in a semantic barrage. And this was probably also the reason why Brigitte Beichel gave us the Quadriga narrative. So, since I can't get to the bottom of all this, I would like to focus on narratives. Talking about narratives has something enchanting. So, we want to determine the direction, and we also have a claim to general validity. And of course, there are always processes of change. There's always a positive freedom, and there's also some certainty inherent in them. You just need to believe in them. The second look is a bit more sobering. When looking at literature, it is noticeable that the terminology is somewhat dazzling, almost as it is the case with all the more modern, almost inflationary concept creations of the social sciences. And since narratives occur in almost all disciplines, it will hardly be possible to distill out one definition of a narrative that makes everything clear at one glance. Narratives have different dimensions with different degrees of agreement as patterns of interpretation, narrative, conviction, and action. They can have both an integrating and a disintegrative effect. The basic thesis for the transfer of the term narrative to the various scientific disciplines is that it is seen as an elementary intellectual activity of man in order to lend a meaningful and comprehensible structure to the complexity surrounding him, and this is why social sciences are also concerned with it. They argue as follows: the uncertainty of people, individually or in states and societies, about future events and developments can be reduced if legitimate authorities act on the basis of existing information according to a procedure regulated by treaties and laws, customs and traditions. This also contributes to the legitimacy and acceptance of decisions and also actions derived from it. This brings us to the foundations of political theory. It's important to note that the narrative term not only understood as a new linguistic resource for academic discourse, but it should also provide political actors with the ability to speak. Now, from a political science perspective, a narrative, and it's completely value neutral, is a narrative that can play a decisive role in political life through at least two functions. On the one hand, as a strategic program of action, it can help to reduce the complexity of the world, open up reality to the actors and thus enable them to act. And on the other hand, it can also create identity as a meta-narrative, and create a structure in which the actors plan and execute their action. Thus, the narrative is understood as a mediating or translating instance between the aspects that are so difficult to reconcile, the actor and the structure. Now, there are at least three central tasks that narratives must achieve for them to be successful. From the organizational sociology point of view, they need to clarify who are we. So they must be able to explain who we are as a state, as a people, a society, an organization. So it's about creating identity, even if Mr. Abenheim doesn't like the term. This has to do with history, tradition, culture, convictions, and clear values. Secondly, what do we want? Narratives must contain a general direction, either to carry out a further defensive or offensive orientation of actions, or to actively break with the past, together with a completely new goal definition. And thirdly, how do we want to reach our goal? Narratives must achieve success, clearly and objectively recognizable or subjectively interpretable in the sense of the narrative. And it follows that in pursuing the objectives derived from the narrative, the actors must mobilize ideational and material resources. So in general, the question is always at stake: how do historical images, political ideas, and active action work in the network of narratives? So we have to ask, why do we need narratives? For the production of safety, security, reassurance, preparing for change, to conceal intentions, or to conceal prior failures. Brigitte Peichel said. Now let's move on to narratives in politics. So in politics, narratives can be understood to have an ordering function. Political science is also a critical science of ordering, so we need to interpret the discourse, be it in politics and science, and they're also social constructs. Narratives are designed from a superordinate point of view, a collective identity for state, politics, society, or institutional environments. And thus, secondly, the foreign policy actions should be put on a coherent basis, and that enables people to act cohesively. And of course, different other areas that can be explained based on this narrative. So narratives describe how the individual actors or elites see their own area and thus distribute resources in order to, establish priorities. That also applies to domestic and foreign policies, because narratives are designed in order to, convince other actors and to influence them. This requires a solid foundation. They also need to be inspiring, so that you have people following you not only at the meta level, but also among the population, ideally. On the other hand, these master narratives can also be present in the pre-political area, or maybe also help with the implementation. This applies to national and transnational discourses equally. So states can develop narratives, but narratives can also come in through scientific discussion, media presence, and determine the policy. They can come from a position of strength, but they can also be developed by other actors in order to delegitimize the stronger, or maybe this self-ascribed victimization. So narratives compete with other narratives on the inside, on the outside, and old rival narratives can be crowded out. They can be successful or they can fail. And there can also be weaknesses in the implementation. So we need to bear in mind that as to the success or failure, we need to bear in mind different references. But we also have to say that narratives also have a certain degree of flexibility. This also differentiates them from rigid ideologies. Sometimes the positions are not negotiable. So this is why narratives, if they intersect with other narratives, they form the ability to maintain the policy. And this leads us to two options for action. And this is this presupposes a fundamental strategic political decision, either a point of contact for the common accomplishment of objectives or challenges can be found, or on the other hand, one side can also become blind if another narrative hits an important own point 100%, but if it is overlooked that a counterpart thus pursues an overall opposite strategy. So in essence, narratives are ideological figures of thought with which political ability can be achieved, irrespective of whether they can be objectified in terms of their foundations, their historical or political bullet resistance. So after this cursory outline, the impression quickly arises that the familiar is being refreshed in a new guise. And in addition, there are very large overlaps to known terms when attempting a concise determination of the content of narratives. We know the term paradigm when we think of science theories, but we also know about the concept of political cultures, which explains us how states and societies, as well as other institutions and milieus, work in the pre-political space. So in the political and social science, we are thus in an area in which we can also speak of a topos, a metaphor, and images. And the same also applies to the area of religion when we think about dogmas. But the analogy to the term design, with a smooth transition to doctrine, can also be seen especially when we read US military science journals. So let us ask a few critical questions in terms of the narrative paradigm. As conclusive and as catchy as many narratives may seem at a first glance, the second glance shows that they can also have structural problems. Science, no matter in what terrain, needs its own language, a system of terms with which findings, analyses, and derived models of thought can be communicated in the scientific community. And the more abstract the approaches are, the more transferable they become to other disciplines. And this is also the objective of the Vienna Strategy Conference. This is also a smaller narrative. So, narratives also need language and concepts for their communication, for science, but even more for politics. These are negotiated in a discourse with judgmental positions, or value judgments. So by assigning roles, moral values are always implanted in the discourse, which inform the audience about what the necessary changes are, who initiates them, and who ultimately blocks them. And even the classical European narrative used to face certain challenges and was presented by the elites almost dogmatically in moralizing dichotomies, so in essence as without alternatives. So just let me remind you of certain quotes that you may have heard in recent years. So Kohl, for example, and Mitterrand, European nationalization, a piece of war, Mitterrand, but it was also charged in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of what Mr. Draghi and Chancellor Merkel said. But at present, it can be observed in politics, I believe, that in the narratives there's a predominance of the disease metaphor and a political causality thinking that operates with allegorical images of imminent doom and thereby gives legitimacy to a justification foil that makes permanent action in states of emergency appear to be without alternatives. And as is well known, this diagnosis already had a tradition in the 20th century. And today, with the so-called migration question, it is quite explosive for the European and for the national narratives. So this finding, or this diagnosis, also shows that narratives can never rely on a closed following. This applies to domestic and to foreign policy aspects. Politics is always a dispute about opinions and worldviews, and in politics decisions are never without alternatives. They are dependent on narrative basic positions, some of which are shown here in this slide just as a typical way. These are ideal, typical, and maybe too concise or overpointed. But anyway, you can see these narratives form the basis for how different actors assess the same identical situation. So it also shows that they are steered and controlled by their own narrative if this situation, which is the same for everybody, is, well, valued differently or assessed differently. And then there's, of course, also different prioritization of measures. And we could also define that some narratives lead to a self-restriction in the choice of means. So let me deduce from this and generally continue with some maybe heretical thesis, also in the form of questions. Narratives can also be understood as being accepted as valid until everything collapses. So how is it when the next major political crisis escalates and everyone wonders whether the armed forces, in spite of all shrinking, are ready to use or ready for action? What if billions of speculations and supposed securities vanish into thin air and everyone asks whether the savings really are safe and who's going to be liable or pay for everything? What if gigantic technology expectations in terms of physics, chemistry and biology get out of control and everyone asks about the responsible ethical dimension and the role of humans? Well, then people say that everyone knew about the narrative, and will the responsibility for the narrative be delegated? Or as Brigadier Paschal said, are some narratives invented to distract from previous failures? And this impression is obvious when we think about the security policy narrative of many European states of the past 20 years. In the naive but nevertheless understandable hope that after the end of the Cold War many things could come to an end of history, and that Western figures of thought such as democracy, human rights and capitalism would expand in the sense of neoliberal ideas to an inescapable global dominance. This is what armed forces don't like. As you know, things turned out quite differently, and thus counter-narratives became increasingly explosive for this originally Western approach. And even in political Europe, there have been upheavals. We know this from the newspapers and from the media. There's only the three mega narratives or mega topics: Brexit, Euro, rescue and migration. And of course the verve of German politicians in the European narrative is based on the fact that, for historical reasons, understood this way, Europe is seen as a central component of German identity policy and thus an overriding strategic narrative. But you know that states and societies are changing. If Germany justifies its restraint historically, it becomes too weak for its partners maybe. Who trusts such a partner who, given its size and location as the central power of Europe, should actually lead? On the other hand, leadership in international politics is often associated with money and the deployment of troops, and which democratically elected parliamentarian minister wants to be responsible for the death of soldiers? So this brings me to the narratives in international relations or in foreign and security policy. So I will make some statements that talk about history but also about the present. The relation to history is essential for forming theories, conceptions, maybe narratives, but also when we're trying to come up with a value judgment. So are we talking about a successful or a failed narrative? So the teaching value is always related to the present and is ultimately dependent on political determination. Even the scientists are not free of this. So anyone who doesn't know and take into account these national narratives that feed on the respective history suffers shipwreck. So an essential point here is that the historical truth, which is of course never definite, is usually not identical with the respected narrative. So narratives are very much based on perceptions and a constructed image of oneself and of others. So if you ask the question whether we can learn from history, and if so, what, then of course we need to know about the limits. Narratives as lessons from history combined with the objective of making it better in the present and future, but they can also be based on false historical teachings. That, of course, depends on the perception, the way you read it. Now, let me give you a few examples. I'm not going to go back as far as the antiquity or the Middle Ages. I would like to talk about modernity. I think their name has been mentioned, this book. For historians and political scientists, it is tempting to think about what this 30-year war that started 400 years ago helps us to understand the Middle East problem: constitutional conflicts, confessional conflicts, territorial conflicts, and hegemonial war. The ingredients for an explosive mix were just as topical back then for the original catastrophe of the early modern era as they are today. But this narrative, which can be used for the present, first had to be established through historical research against a narrative that for centuries cultivated the 30 Years' War as a religious conflict and as a German primordial disaster of modern times. False traditional narratives can thus lay an unusable foundation. Another instructive example is, one could say, the preferred Russian victim narrative. The keywords are quickly outlined: Mongolian storm or invasion in the 13th century, the Swedish invasion under Charles XII in the beginning of the 18th century, Napoleon invaded in 1812, the Barbarossa Company in June 41, then the encirclement of the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War by the US-led alliances NATO, SEATO, etc., and then NATO's eastward expansion, which was actually a Western orientation of states formerly occupied by the Soviet Union. So the conquest and rounding off offensive of the Russian Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union, which was pursued in the historical intermediate eras, are, however, excluded. Here we can talk about neglected security narrative.
Now, on the other hand, the perception of this negative master narrative, and on the other hand, the effect on the population, which was controlled by neutrally formulated information operations, are constitutive for this. Within the framework of this narrative, Russian action in Crimea and eastern Ukraine can also be explained to a large extent because it was skillfully linked to the narrative of identity and the foreign policy objectives of the Russian Federation. In addition, however, the Russian side had a home game in Crimea in political, strategic, and geographic terms, as was said by Mr. Schmidt in an essay. A much-cited hybrid war works best if the state and society on the other party are already destabilized before the start of their own operation. In addition to the victim narrative, there is also the envy narrative, with which the active design or penetration into a reasonably stable system is to be achieved. To clarify this, one can compare the extent to which China's foreign policy objective in some respects resembled the foreign policy of the German Reich around 1900, the German Empire. High population, strong economic growth, high technological and financial innovation, trust in strong monocratic rule, strong self-confidence and sense of mission, strong army, growth of the navy, the feeling of earning a place in the sun, quote-unquote, combined with military power and a large economic project. At that time, the Baghdad Railway, today, the new continental and maritime Silk Road. Just as the German Empire once challenged the trade, maritime and hegemonic power of Great Britain, today China is considered a rival for the global hegemonic policy of the US. Another example. Looking at international relations after 1945, Professor Oppenheimer already referred to this. He talked about the genesis of the Cold War. It can be seen at first glance that here too there are different narratives, ideological oppositions or perceptions, differences of perceptions. Then freedom, capitalism, and democracy are not compatible with communism. Second, ideological positions are of secondary importance for the real power projection and the development of political states and base systems that are safe for their own sphere of influence. So, differences in perception, one's own glasses, always impute negative intentions to the opposing actor, even if they are objectively committed to a completely different objective. The resulting actions of both sides can then contribute to an escalation spiral, because one is fundamentally misjudging oneself. The Western hegemonial power of the US, well, we talked about propaganda, movies, and all of that, used catchy, almost timeless narrative to legitimize its own actions, and saw itself as a mixture of Rome and Athens, stylized NATO as the successor of the Attische Seebund stood for democracy, freedom of culture, while the role of the successor of the Persian despotism was ascribed to the hegemonial power of the Soviet Union. So powerful narratives need a strong, self-confident view of history. The Western Europeans did not aim for a narrative of delimitation. Their narrative grew primarily from the shadows of the past. Basically, this is a powerful narrative, but it also had reasons and limits. The age of bloc confrontation, with its nuclear, strategic, and ideological implications, did not allow the formation of a genuine European political actor. Europe could therefore only be realized as a construct based on human rights, culture, and economy in the West of the continent. The European institutions, the Council of Europe, the Coal and Steel Community, and the EC, founded by the Treaty of Rome, well, they were also both answers to the previous history and bets on the future. The European Union, founded after the Annus Mirabilis of 1989-90 with the Maastricht Treaty, became an effective promise with its soft narratives, democracy, human rights, prosperity, which had been handed down for decades. Peace dividends were paid out by the European states. The security policy welfare of Europeans should still take place under the protection of NATO, better still, not be necessary in a new world. Europe was concerned with a Europe of rights and prosperity, but not with a Europe of external security and the question of its finality. In other words, it had no answer to the question of whether and how it could be more than an economic giant in a world unleashed by different dynamics. Europe could only stand if the second leg, NATO, lent steadfastness. So the EU had only half a strategic narrative, even if this concept was not yet present. Some years ago, this contrast was described, albeit still in a transatlantic context, as Venus versus Mars. Robert Kagan said this: we should no longer pretend that Europeans and Americans have the same worldview or even live in the same world. He outlined the discussion and development of the following years, and he anticipated them. I just mentioned this quote, so let me also remind you of what Sigmar Gabriel, the former German foreign minister, said shortly after leaving office. In a world full of carnivores, vegetarians have a very hard time. It seems that all forms of liberal and multilateral narratives, when it comes to the implementation and effectiveness in a world of realistic narratives following autocrats and their regimes, well, I think that this has sort of presupposed the near future. Now, can I still talk about hybrid war? Okay. All right. Allow me to conclude with a few thoughts on hybridity. This literature about it is, meanwhile, all-encompassing. Basically, hybrid warfare can be understood as an attempt to increase complexity through a creative combination of civil and military means, the synchronization of which is intended to serve the political goal of generally supporting non-democratic actors, and thereby also strengthening one's own position of power in the international arena. Uwe Hartmann also said this the day before yesterday. Well, there are two narratives that clash. While the West prefers a comprehensive approach and wants to pursue nation-building, the objective of hybrid warfare is to achieve the erosion of statehood through instability of the political, social, and economic situation, and through the delegitimization of government and elites. The terms hybridity and hybrid warfare are therefore the basis and result of a new complexity. But it's important for me to point out that these annual recreations of terms have certainly led to the semantic barrage diagnosed at the beginning, or mentioned at the beginning, which makes the overview difficult, even for those interested in these topics. The attempt to integrate the novelty into the Green Martian narrative in order to remain below the war threshold and thus avoid the intervention of others could succeed because the terms for capturing had already been deconstructed earlier, as was said by Hartmann in a paper. War and peace, state war and civil war, symmetric and asymmetric warfare, combatants and non-combatants are no longer clear-cut terms. but also the accumulation of modern concepts such as new wars. You all know this term: postmodern warfare, small wars, asymmetry, nonlinear warfare, three-block war, etc., etc. Well, that did not necessarily increase the predictive capacity derived from the description and analysis for the next conflict, if the concepts were developed either eclectically across epochs to underpin the new concept or on the basis of examples from the last conflict. And we all know, of course, that the chameleon is changing. So, in the scientific area, there is a hype going on. It's basically old things that we know from military history. The possibilities of a smaller, poor man. Of course, hybridity also requires the strategic backing of a larger actor, because otherwise one's own possibilities of the subordinate actors can very quickly be dried up. Hybrid players do not live on an island. As quickly as the new and old forms of conflict resolution came to life, so quickly that's my impression, well, just as quickly they're countered by an increased return to national and alliance defense. Because the core remains who represents what interest or pursues what interest. Now, the next few years will show to what an extent this new strategic turn of events will be supported in terms of personnel, material, institutions, and operations. Well, but just this different thinking obviously shows that the long-trained and beloved narrative of many EU Europeans failed because of real developments. Now, I'm Swabian, even though I try to speak High German, but my colleague was someone who loves theory, and he said that many who have cherished and cultivated their own narratives will certainly not like if theory does not agree with practice, all the worse for reality. So, what conclusions can be drawn? The aim was not necessarily to undress narratives. Narratives are certainly an important component of critical order science, quote-unquote. But narratives, of course, match everything and nothing. Now, narratives, of course, have been in the focus for the past 2 decades, because they talk about a world in disorder. But narratives are also location-bound, which can be seen in the fact that a world in disorder can also be seen as a world on the move. A negative one can therefore always be opposed by a positive narrative. This is often described with a metaphor, borrowed from Chinese wisdom. When the wind of change blows, some build walls, others windmills. But saying or spouting wisdoms from Chinese antiquity, that's not always helpful for overcoming current challenges unless we think that the Chinese feel closely connected to their narratives, their own narratives, and only orient their policies to them. If we understand security policy precautions as part of state policy, then it must take care of clarity in the concepts, the formulation of your own positions, and the recognition of political goals of potentially opposing actors, and using the will to assert and shape yourself, and, which is derived from this, the provision of material as well as military aid. It's still advisable to make a sober assessment of the situation. Old and new narratives only help temporarily. If these serve as precautions for the capacity of state politics to act, and intertwine ethical convictions and responsible ethical aspects, then, and only then, can they last in the long run. Yet they're also nicely packaged. The narratives are certainly helpful to increase the legitimacy of actors and the binding nature of decisions taken and subsequent action. However, dealing with self-chosen narratives must not lead to self-glare, quote-unquote. Security policy and strategy formation are far too serious issues to be guided by fashionable terms. If narratives obscure the obvious, or even turn out to be dysfunctional, then they must be reviewed and, if necessary, also rejected, especially if the factual foundations of perception are the basis, as a basis for a narrative were wrong, and a new security policy statement, ideal political wishful thinking dissolved in real politics. Then, it's advisable to think of what Jean-François Lyotard, as was pointed out on the first day of our conference, already said in 1986 in his book, The Postmodern Knowledge. namely the end of meta-narratives. Let's therefore concentrate on the core, the classical analysis of strategic goals of a multitude of actors, which certainly includes the analysis of their narratives. But let's not be blinded by our own or foreign narratives when they have proven to be fog candles. In the words of German football coach Otto Rehagel, the truth is on the pitch. Well, he was bound to know, because he even became European champion with Greece in 2004. Thank you.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Dr. Eberhard Birk. Danke.
Well, thank you very much, Eberhard Birk, for this very academic presentation of narratives in science and politics. So, you talked about theory a lot and science, and you then also turned to the issues at hand, and you spoke very, very fast. You gave us examples, case analyses were elucidated, and you also talked about very current European developments. You also furnished quotes, including the one by Sigmar Gabriel, who talked about a world of carnivores, and he said in our world of carnivores, vegetarians have a hard time, which I think pinpoints your arguments exactly. Well, thanks for this very ideological view on narratives and societal and political developments. Thank you also for talking about these notions referring to strategic thinking. You've actually touched on the core of our conference, and you hit the nail on the head. Let's now come to our Q&A period before the break starts. Now, as far as Mr. Birk's presentation is concerned, are there any questions that you have? Well, I'm sure you're eager for coffee, aren't you? Well, the same goes for us. So, thank you once more. Enjoy the coffee break. And dear Eberhard, this award-winning Strategos wine as a token of our appreciation. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Eberhard Birk, well, whenever he delves into theory, few questions are put because it's been so complex. On the other hand, your approach is a very profound one, a very important one. Well, just read his books and essays. So, the basics of narratives and resilience can be found in his papers. Well, let's now start with our coffee break. Let's not rush things. Now, the program is a bit infinite, if I may say so, because Professor Schüchtern will meet with the foreign minister, so he will only join us a bit later. So we can actually take our time. We don't have to rush things. The cyber panel will have a bit more time because it's a very important issue after all. And the panel may actually also take a bit longer. But the lunch break will start on time. And now the lunch break starts and we'll resume at 10:15. Thank you.